Welcome back, everybody. For those, my name is Tim Profeta. I am the director of the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, one of the partners in this project at the university. And I'm really just thrilled to have you here and have my 5 colleagues join me on this panel. And you know, as Jim mentioned, Jim and I began this process exploring this topic about now 3 years ago, teaching that initial course at Duke. And you know, to have gone from there to here and to you know, have this day of announcing this project is really a thrill. I've been blessed, but almost cursed with this panel because we have about 50 minutes on our calendar, and I think I could ask each of you to speak for 50 minutes and be learning at the end of the panel. So I'm going to try and minimize my voice in this. But we have you know, 5 colleagues. I'm going to introduce each of you very briefly. I would invite you to look at the bios of our 5 panelists and realize the depth of expertise that's represented here. And then ask each of you for like just about a minute or two of a framing. I mean, and what I'd like you to speak to a little bit is, you know, we just heard a panel about sort of the challenge of scaling and getting the microgrids. I want to also think about that last mile of electrification too, and you know, what is the challenge to get to every person and the human development need of getting electricity and energy to folks. So I'm going to start with Xavier Helgesen on my end. Xavier is the CEO of Off-Grid Electric, one of the pioneers in the solar home system market. Then I'm going to move on to Katherine Lucey, who's the founder and CEO of Solar Sister. Katherine's one of those people we mentioned who got trained in business chops in Wall Street, as we heard last night, but then really moved to try and think about how we get sustainable energy to the people in the places of most need. Then I will move to Sasanka, Thilakasiri, if I got that right, who's a senior policy advisor for climate change and energy at Oxfam America. Then Kristina Skierka, who's the CEO of Power for All, which has been created as a campaign with and a movement towards universal energy access by 2020. And then we'll end with Hela, Cheikhrouhou, who has just launched, I don't know exactly how recently you'll tell us, but Nithio, which is a off-grid analytics and financing platform startup that will be sort of bringing in all the knowledge that's been building over the last 5 years and trying to bring these business models to scale. I really will stop there by really, the depth of knowledge here is much deeper than this was announced, and I'd like you to look at their bios in the materials. But Xavier, can I ask you to start with a minute or two of framing comments?
Yeah, I would. You know, I would just say we've been doing last mile distribution in the far corners of Tanzania, Rwanda, various places in West Africa for 5+ years now, and it is one of the defining challenges of the sector, I think, and of really reaching everyone. And there may be a few more obvious, a few less obvious. So, you know, more obvious is things like we design everything to fit on the back of a motorcycle, for example, right? And that's actually a pretty hard design constraint that you need to have, because the majority of these folks will not be on paved roads, but they will be somewhere that's broadly accessible, usually by a motorcycle, sometimes by a bicycle, or even something else. There's things that are less obvious, which is that the more remote people are, I think the more intermittent their incomes are, the more likely they are to rely almost entirely on maybe a few harvests a year. And so the more difficult it is to have a kind of fixed daily or weekly or monthly fee that they pay. And also, frankly, the riskier their credit is. They don't have a backstop if if something goes wrong, or if there's climate issues that delay the harvest, et cetera. So I think we have an incredible data set. Now we have millions and millions of mobile payments in our database, and we are, actually able to see climate shocks happen in the payment data, which is pretty crazy. And so I've become more and more obsessed with how do we bring in multilateral capital, like what Hela's doing, I think is so important. How do we bring in alternative distribution models like Katherine to bring down the cost of reaching these customers through kind of existing social networks and bonds? I think it really is a cost question. And increasingly, it's not the cost of the hardware. That's what everyone needs to understand. It's the cost of the capital and the cost of the sales to reach those customers that is really keeping a lot more people from having energy access.
Thanks, Xavier. I want to pass to Katherine. And Katherine, I'd love you to talk about the distribution model of Solar Sister that Xavier just raised as well.
Great. I'm glad you said that because he just said what I was going to say. So when I first got into Solar Sister, I come from a finance background and an engineering mindset and data and analysis, and really love getting into the numbers and figuring this all out. And when you're looking at capital and you're looking at business models and coming out of business school, those are all really great things. What I found out was when I started Solar Sister, working with last mile customers, it's not about any of that, or it's about that, but it's not only about that. And the biggest piece of it the classes that I skipped back in business school of organizational behavior and psychology and customer sales, those were the ones that I really needed. Human resource, how do you deal and service customers, and how do we really understand people? So over the last few years with Solar Sister, what we do is it's a network of women entrepreneurs. So we are recruiting, training, supporting women to be in their community entrepreneurs, bringing clean energy technology to their communities. So it's solar lamps, clean cook stoves, home systems, and even up to fully designed and installed systems. Really trying to lift the women up to run their own businesses so that it's a sustainable network, that it's a low cost, very nimble, very flexible cost network to get the products out there by people who really are known and trusted in their community. And we just did some research recently around last mile, and the two pieces of it that I'll mention right now are, the first was, what is last mile? And I think we all, can define it generally, but what we looked at is combining a few different elements. It's a combination of, access to the grid. How far away are you logistically from the grid? Are you connected to the grid? Those are two different things. Your poverty level, can you afford to connect to the grid? And then also your remoteness. So even though someone might be physically fairly close to the grid, if they are remote because of no road access between here and there, then again, it's remoteness for services as well. So it's a combination of factors that make someone last mile, and that could be someone in the middle of a city, could be a last mile customer, as well as somebody who's in a more traditional, very far away, looks like they're last mile when you're looking at them. And the other piece of the research that we looked at was know your customer. Who is your customer for this marketplace, and really understanding them and what are their preferences, what are they looking for in this business relationship. If they're buying products from you, who is buying the products from you, and doing some really deep analysis in that, and what are their preferences. And the two things that we found overwhelmingly were the customer preferences were trust. Do they trust the person that they're buying from? And do they know them? And then secondly, proximity. Is that person based there in their community so that this is not just a one-time sale, we call them the drive-by sales, where somebody shows up with the truck and kind of throws the product off the back of the truck, but that somebody who's living in their community makes the sale, is available then for aftermarket service and follow-on sales, and really understands them very much. So those were the two components that overwhelmingly drove customer preference.
Great. Sasanka, I wanted to come to you, and I want to think a little bit about, I think a lot of the models we heard about in the first panel are, they are in the peri-urban space, or, and think about getting out to the last mile, though. I'm intrigued by the last mile in the middle of, Nairobi, as well as the last mile in rural. But as we think about getting the last mile, what is the role of public money, of subsidies, of the public sector in reaching those customers, and how would you evaluate the need for that?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks, Duke, for putting this on and inviting us. Really glad we're getting into the weeds here, and I think that this is a great segue from the last panel when it talked about productive use. and some of the challenges there, because affordability becomes such a critical problem when we're going out into the extreme last mile connections. And it really did some of the things I want to touch on here based on some of our program experience work that we have in microgrids in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, is having this sort of a holistic approach when we look at the planning and development of these projects. This is at an institutional level. A lot of the work that I do historically, I guess, and now I'm sort of trying to get into more on the groundwork, is with institutional investors like the DFIs, the IFIs. When they're going in and deciding on these investment processes, a lot of the times it's a black box process between the investor, the donor, the government. Very rarely do communities or civil society be part of that conversation. So that's number one. But then at a much more on the ground process, it's this idea of looking at a total ecosystem approach and not necessarily looking at energy access in isolation. But we found that models where it works the best is when you connect it to other types of social services, infrastructure, agricultural extension services. The problem is it's very easy for us to say that and then say, okay, government, go off and do all this in a holistic manner when you have restricted budgetary constraints. I don't know if people have found this, but I'm sure everyone here, when you've gone and spoken to ministries and ministers in these different ministries within these governments, they very much are very issue-orientated, and sometimes, often, I've found, have no idea about certain programs that are happening just next door down the hallway. So Ministry of Finance has no idea what's going on about the rural electrification program, doesn't know what the environment minister's saying around climate commitments. So there's a real siloing problem. So one of the things that I think is critical is to try and bring all these different agencies together, but then to make sure that we're doing that in a way that has community engagement throughout the process. And I can say more and dive in as we get into it, but that's broadly, I think, one aspect.
I'll move us along, but I want to come back and I want to think about who helps bridge those silos, who has that role, and maybe, Hela, you can help us, having been as charged with the Ministry of Environment in Tunisia, about what you think might be the best intervention. But let me go to Kristina in Power for All. Kristina, I think there's a sense of urgency that's on our electrification goals that we all have, but it's not always reflected. And I mean, I'm wondering if maybe we can think about how we communicate that urgency, and I'm thinking about the energy access dividend conversations we've had and the work you've just recently published with SE for All on that topic, and maybe that could help us frame that question as well. But.
Yeah, so it's great to be here, and thanks again to Duke, not only for this event, but for also, really putting not just your toe in the water, but your whole foot. Because we definitely, I think we've heard a lot over the last few days about how much we need, not just data, because I think that's in specific, but we really need more information and knowledge, and not just knowledge, but knowledge that goes into insight that actually helps us make changes in the world. So for those who don't know Power for All is a global campaign. We've got over 200 partners, many of which are in the room, including Off-Grid Electric, the Climate Reality Project, GOGLA. And our focus has always been, as Tim pointed out, to really put urgency into the conversation about energy access. And in terms of how we communicate urgency, I think that's a really critical piece and something that all of us can actually be a part of. In fact, we do take a lot of inspiration from the Climate Reality Project and the idea of creating echo chambers, arming people as a campaign with the right information they need to make powerful, impactful, evidence-based arguments for why we need a faster path to access. And as part of that, I think I heard some comments on the last panel, something about that you could trust governments to figure it out, and that the grid is eventually going to be everywhere. Okay, maybe, but sovereign risk is a real issue, and there's a really important role for our sector to play that includes representatives on this panel. So it's civil society. It is some government, absolutely. It's also working with the existing power structures to transform the way we're thinking about access and address new technologies in a way that can actually be used. So actionable information, actionable knowledge is, I think, what we're really about. And when it comes right down to it, you know, a lot of our work to date has been really focused on, I think, legitimizing this sector. So coming up with arguments and stories at a global level that challenge, for example, the way that MDBs have been investing in energy, or also challenge the way that national policy shows up on the ground to give a more level playing field for this sector. And I think that next piece for us, which we're actually going to be working with some of the partners in the room here today on, is an effort we call Utilities 2.0, and that is really to get at the table decentralized and centralized energy, traditional and new forms of energy, to work together to put that urgency into play. But the critical piece in all of this is that if you're waiting for governments to make a change, you're going to be waiting a long time. And so for us, it's an ecosystem that really makes that difference. And you're going to see political changes. You know, we have a little sovereign risk in our country right now, if I could say that. But to that point, to create a movement, you have to really not just rely on one center of power. You have to create all sorts of centers of power that work together, and that's what we try to do in countries. So this approach we call market activation really brings that urgency to life, whether it's doing the work we're doing, for example, in Nigeria right now, to train rural electrification agency civil servants, so not the people at the top levels that agree and say, yes, we have targets, decentralized is a great idea, but to train the people at the civil servant level to make these changes and to incorporate technologies and give them something to care about that's bigger than just their day jobs. It does make a difference. That's what campaigns are for. It's about inspiration, and it's a critical piece of achieving universal electrification before 2030.
Wonderful. So, Hela, I can go so many different directions with what has already been said by our colleagues, but I'd like to sort of speak to sort of the challenges that you've been hearing here. I think, as I mentioned, you know, you're a minister of energy in Tunisia. You also, you know, help stand up the Green Climate Fund. So, you know, think about multilateral money coming to the table, and then Nithio, your new venture, and how that might try and stitch these, you know, this formula together in a way that can allow these both these technologies to get to scale, but also to reach these last miles as well. If you could speak to that.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And again, I applaud Duke University for organizing this. After 15 years of multilateral finance experience, I can only echo everything that has been said, that my continent, Africa, is the biggest remaining challenge for access to energy, and the way we are going about it in the mainstream sector of energy, which is working through the national utilities, incorporating independent power producers, but basically a lot of the bet by policymakers, by investors, by financiers are only on grid extension, is not going to get us there in Africa. A recent report by the International Energy Agency projects that by 2030, there will still be 600 million Africans with no form of modern energy, because everything we know will only be offsetting demographic growth. So how do we solve this? Actually, right now, we are not efficiently deploying taxpayers' monies towards that last mile. And I like the fact that this panel is about that last mile. Many instances for me and many others in the room where we worked relentlessly on a large-scale power project saying this is going to alleviate the livelihood of millions of people in this country or this region, and then all the power is captured by a large mining company or is exported to some industrial outfit. That's important, but it's not access. So access has not necessarily been in the mainstream of energy investments of the development finance institutions. I think this is starting to change slowly, and Nithio, among other things, will help accelerate this in our view, because what we hope to do is work with these emerging, vibrant, small, medium-scale distributed energy service companies, enable them to have an underwriting tool for consumer risk, enable them to take all these pay-as-you-go receivables off their balance sheet to be not constrained by this in their growth, and help have an intermediated solution to deploy money at scale. And when I say money, it means not only commercially priced debt, but also concessional or even grant, because policymakers are willing, and they do it every day in every country, to subsidize energy, except most of the subsidies, 80% in Tunisia, is captured by people that don't need it. They have the ability to pay. We need an efficient way of targeting precision finance, and today, with all the new technologies deployed by these innovative companies and with the power of data, we are powered as Nithio, as a startup, we are powered by geospatial data analytics in Africa. We're able to help those who have these resources and policymakers to deploy commercial and public funds at scale to help reach the base of the pyramid, which often is missed by the traditional rural electrification projects.
Wonderful. So I'm going to, first of all, I want to make sure I note this. We are going to lose Xavier to an 11 o'clock phone call, so I want to go back to Xavier and also make sure that he doesn't feel bad about having to scoot out the door to be on that call. Xavier, you know, OGE just closed a round of financing. Clearly, the model has worked. The market is, but you sort of have. I think you're trying to grow both your business model and your geographies. And so as we look at sort of this conversation about the role of the public sector in that last mile, the role of other sort of players, what is it that you as an entrepreneur need to know as you think about entering new markets and trying to reach new populations, whether they're just in new nations or a little bit farther out into the rural area?
That's a great question, and we do a ton of proprietary research before we go into a market, and some of that is statistical, and some of that is more sentiment based. So we do studies like having customers essentially build their own configurations of solar systems with various appliances, and then we have kind of a smart pricing model tied to that then surfaces how much they would pay for the energy side, but it's really based on what they're actually going to use. Because we started the business when I moved to Arusha, Tanzania, which is a very temperate place, and so I don't think we even realized that people needed fans for like 3 or 4 years till we started getting all these customers in the coastal regions and so on. So there's also a lot of regional variation in this. So I think as you go to new markets, I think there's some basic framework stuff, right? Some countries still tax. Think about this: they have import duties on solar energy systems, while deeply financing the state utility with taxpayer funds. And so they're actually taxing the relatively poor distributed customer base to mainly fund industry's electricity at a subsidized rate. So that happens a fair bit, and I think that should be flipped. As noted, almost no money from people always say, oh, this must all be funded from the World Bank or from AFDB, and really almost none of those funds flow to this distributed sector today, and it's a real hairy, thorny challenge, right? Because you essentially are taking public funds and funding distributed, privately owned in general assets, except for maybe distributed mini grids, and that's something we haven't really done before at scale, at least in quite the same way. So I think for us, I think my pain in this, as I get as an entrepreneur who started this and said, what do I want to do? I want to make solar ubiquitous and mass market in Africa, and that's why I've devoted the last 6 years of my life and probably the next 20 to this is, and you see that you get drawn toward the peri-urban customers who have stable incomes and have multiple sources of incomes. And it's really, really hard to serve the rural poor with a purely commercial model. And so I think where this is, but the rural poor also want far more than a very, very basic solution. They want TVs and fans and refrigerators and whatever else irons and whatever else you can think of. And so bridging that gap as much as we can, I think, is the real kind of challenge. And honestly needs a bunch of players, because as a private company, you can't go organize the government by yourself to have a sophisticated finance system for distributed renewables.
Can I jump in here? And Xavier, I think it'd be really interesting to talk about too, because I noticed over this last week, I was also doing an event at Columbia this week. Everybody stopped talking about MFIs. And it's fascinating to me because everybody's talking about different capital flows, but MFIs have been actually really important, especially in India with distribution. I mean, there are distribution networks that have been highly successful, right? Kerosene, quite frankly, has a very successful distribution network, but so does Coke, and MFIs as well. So do you think there's a way to piggyback or work together with those systems?
It's a tricky one, honestly. I think MFIs do have a decent distribution network. Their model is predicated on a very high nominal rate of interest, right? Somewhere between 60 and 100% in general in local currency, and a relatively short tenure, right? Six months to a year. So I think the tricky bit of working with MFIs to finance energy is that's really what they're set up to do. They're set up to make loans to people, and the incentive for people to pay those off is mainly to get more loans. And so I think that's just a little different ethos than what folks like us are trying to do, which is get energy in the home, which is a secured loan, which should be able to be loaned over a longer period of time, and therefore kind of bring the monthly cost down.
I want to make sure everybody knows what MFI is.
Yeah, right. So it's microfinance institution, which typically makes, I don't know, call it a $500 loan to mainly rural folks. So I haven't seen that. I've been interested. I've seen some evidence of that starting to scale with some women's cooperative structures in Kenya. So I also think it's not something we should write off either. But I've been surprised in some way, because you would also think that would be the natural distribution partner, but then it just doesn't seem to be the same psychology and the same sales process, and at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, and I would like to pick on something Xavier mentioned, which is these are secured loans. It's like asset-based finance. You have a good, the solar home system installed in those homes. And those are the more promising ways of financing individuals, households, or small, medium-scale enterprises that are distributing them, because these are self-liquidating type of loans that you have an asset that's the collateral and you are financing against it. This is why the thesis behind this bridging instrument we are building at Nithio is about purchasing the receivables and facilitating access to more cost-effective sources of capital that these energy companies need to keep growing and to reach fully access for all. We think this is an avenue that can be very promising, allows to reach scale without overburdening the balance sheets of the smaller energy companies. It requires, however, the emergence of this class of intermediaries that can take this risk of these rural consumers that are typically unbanked, except for Kenya, where you have a credit bureau. Most countries, you don't have that. So it's important to be able to have this new class that understands consumer risk and is willing to bring this capital at scale to these consumers.
I think that's really right. I mean, I can't speak for every company in the sector, but very, very few of us want to be a bank. Like we didn't intend to do that, and that's what our balance sheet looks like, a bank today.
Katherine?
So we are doing a pilot with BRAC on, where they're lending to the customer, where the distribution. But it's a pilot, and it's interesting. Even in that phase, the feedback we get from them is they don't really like this asset that they're lending against. They're not happy with the. They don't want to be stuck with a lot of solar products if somebody goes bad on the loan, versus the typical process that they go through is it's a very paper-based and relationship-based and experiential-based, where they lend again and again and again to the same person in a group where it's cross-collateral or collateralized by asset, meaning their home. So taking on solar products as a collateral is not something they're so excited about, especially as technology. This is, I think, one of our biggest challenges, and our opportunity here is that as technology is advancing so rapidly, that the product that I today put up as collateral, the home system that I put up today, 6 months from now is obsolete because a new, better, faster, more powerful and cheaper one is on the market. And so the aging of that collateral happens really fast. So that's, I think, part of the challenges of working with the MFI companies. And I think that we've seen, for example, from the time we started to now, that advancing technology, the improving technology, the changing landscape and the rapidity of that change creates a real challenge for all of us in the sector. I mean, if you looked at the business model when we first started out, where the least, the smallest products you could sell was maybe a $20 lamp. And, you could make, in the home systems where maybe, a $500 home system or something. And now the prices of those is so much lower, which is fantastic from an access point of view. But it makes it very hard from the company's point of view for investing in that technology and relying on that technology, and your aging inventory, and keeping it ahead of that is really tough.
I want to go back, and I just, looking at the time, realize how fast this time is fleeting by. But I want to go back to Sasanka, what you were saying about the government role and particularly agencies not connecting up on the need to invest and subsidize and then in sort of that last mile challenge. Also, Xavier's observation about where the subsidies are being captured as opposed to where maybe the need was. Two questions. One is, how do we solve, Sasanka, your problem of connecting or crossing the silos? And second, and maybe related, is one of the things that we talked about with Power for All quite a bit is, the need to really develop more and fill the gaps in our understanding between the connection between access and the development benefits. I mean, we all have to say it anecdotally, but really communicating that and also quantifying that more. And would that help both connect across the silos and also help justify the case a little bit more?
So on the how, my big kick for a long time has been multi-stakeholder initiatives, MSI, or multi-stakeholder platforms, MSPs, whatever you can call it. And simply put, it's not looking at one specific set of actors. It's let's make sure communities, industry associations, governments, investors are all brought together in a convening space or a platform or an association. And traditionally, we found that tends to work well. So when, Javier, you mentioned about import tariffs, I'm thinking of the microgrid that we were involved in Sierra Leone with one of the partners, Powerful, actually was one of the partners too. The aspect that we brought to that project initially was around women's training and running sort of solar training workshops. But then we specifically brought in one of the utilities from the central government to come along because this wasn't a diesel-related microgrid. It was I think Sierra Leone's only solar-based microgrid at the time, and that was a really successful model. And what came out of that was a renewable energy association that was brought together by that utility partner, the community, the women community that we had there, and they were actually able to, as a group, collectively lobby the government to waive the import tariffs from solar projects. We see again and again, whether it's a project in Vietnam where we've brought in local government partners to actually work with the communities directly from the onset, that tends to be a really great way of breaking down some of these silos. So if there's one message I would put out there is try and look for these MSI opportunities at every step of the way. I can say more about the development outcome piece, but I want others to.
Can I just, let me build on that, because it really was a great partnership in Sierra Leone, and it just goes to show what happens when you don't wait for government to make the changes, but you actually engage the change makers on the ground and upskill them with knowledge. And literally, one of the things that SAS didn't mention, it was in 90 days that these changes to tariff laws were made, which is unbelievable. Now, part of that was also having the ministry endorsement, absolutely, and a target that was well said and echoed frequently to have universal energy access for everyone in Sierra Leone by 2025. But when it comes to sort of the urgency and the policy and dividends discussion, I mean, we found, we did an analysis last year you can find on our website that looks at what are the three sort of harbingers of success for the sector. And if there's three sort of institutional changes a country needs, one is to have first a universal energy access target, no doubt. It's an important market signal, though, to follow that up with a rural electrification target, since that's what we're talking about for the sector, as well as a carve out for decentralized renewables. Now, what we found is a majority of energy poor countries have the first two, most don't have the last. But yet it does an incredible thing. When we saw in Sierra Leone, when we had that carve out and targets for decentralized renewables, within 6 months, the sector grew by 10x. And it literally went from a post-Ebola crisis state to one of the most thriving markets for decentralized renewables. So now, look, there's still a long way to go, but it just goes to show how you communicate about something and who communicates it and the frequency of it being communicated, how that makes a difference. But on the dividends piece, it really is a key issue because oftentimes, not only do the ministries of energy that we interact with, we're working in 5 or 6 countries right now, they don't understand decentralized renewables and really how to sort of pave the way for growth. But beyond that, to somebody else's comment, you don't get ministries interacting a lot. I mean, it's just like our government, right? Here in the U.S., there is silos. And so, again, that's where a campaign approach, where you're trying to get not only different parts of the ecosystem involved, but different players in the MDAs, the ministries, department, and agencies to be involved in how the benefits help them win their own targets is really critical.
I just want to build on this multi-stakeholder aspect importance. This is also one of the drivers of how we work in Nithio, because something that Xavier mentioned is not often acted upon, which is that those last mile communities in the rural areas tend to also be those most vulnerable to climate change. So in Eastern Africa, when climate change has led to one of the worst droughts in the last few years, there was very little climate finance flowing to those rural areas to help through, for instance, electrification. People withstand better and live survive through these droughts, which we were signing in New York, the Paris Climate Agreement. At the same time, tens of millions of people in rural Ethiopia were suffering from the drought. So vehicles like the Green Climate Fund, which I had the opportunity to launch a few years ago, have the resources. We mobilized together $10 billion. Very little of it is flowing to this segment of decentralized rural electrification, even though these are the same communities suffering the most from the impact of climate change. This is why we think it's very important and opportune that those instruments with significant capacity to take risk and to take consumer default risk, because this consumer default is coming from climate change, should be, they are the best, when you say you're allocating risk to those who can bear it the best, some of these actors are the best. But this is where vehicles, like what we are trying to do in Nithio, to really allow specialized finance vehicles like the GCF, governments, private enterprises, multilateral finance, private finance come together and each one take the slice of risk and exposure they are ready to withstand, so that these millions and hundreds of millions in the case of Africa finally have a hope by 2030 to have a modern form of energy. So multi-stakeholder engagement is a priority.
Katherine?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. As you look at the available, that energy runs through everything, and so the energy and agriculture sector, pulling those together and recognizing how essential energy is to maximize agriculture outputs, energy and healthcare, using the energy resources to light up clinics and provide electricity to clinics and to healthcare workers, energy and education. And so because all of these energy runs through all of this, cooperating between those different ministries and cooperating between those different sectors is so important in unlocking the solutions.
All right. First of all, for my colleagues, I'm going to run this till 11:10. I don't want to cut this too far short, so apologies or forgiveness, whichever is appropriate. Second, I'm going to now pass this mic in a second to the audience. I want to ask one question while we walk around to people with their hands up, which is the question you won't be surprised to ask, which is, from what you've learned about Duke and what Duke's ambitions are here, this is, I could spend days exploring just Nithio's model and all of your models, but what are the things that a university that's willing to convene, and one university that's willing to get its hands dirty in the dirt, what are the things we could do to help contribute to the dynamics you're expressing here? And with that, I'm going to yield my microphone over to the audience.
So I can jump in. I think Alexia mentioned it in the last panel. It is incredibly hard and expensive to do rigorous impact evaluation of these microgrid projects. We have a project in Malawi that we're just kicking off in partnership with the Scottish Government, where we're trying to take a holistic approach. It's solar irrigation, but we're looking at setting up agro-processing facilities and a business enterprise development program. But we had to really, really beg to kick in about another 10 grand to try and do a proper detailed impact evaluation assessment. And what initial research we've done in the academic literature, there's not a lot out there in looking at what are the circumstances where these types of systems work well, specifically from a KPI, if you will, of looking at productivity increases. It's very thin. So I would, but then we're seeing a lot of great work happening in the field right now. So I would say, to the extent that you can help us when we have these programs to do that, bring that academic rigor, I guess, to the impact evaluation side of things, would be one of my pleas.
And you probably know what I'm going to say, but two things. So first of all, more help on the dividend work is critical, and I know that Duke has been doing some effort on that. And just for those who it seems like a strange phraseology, the energy access dividend is a look at what are the payoffs for having faster access that comes from decentralized renewables. And it's incredibly difficult to find that kind of data, which is cross-cutting to some of the themes of the panel. It's really country-based. And so while we've got maybe a plethora of data on benefits from earlier access in, say, Kenya, it's quite difficult in other countries. And a lot of times that takes very high-touch, intensive, one-to-one research. And so having bodies and money to do that would be awesome. And then finally, you've heard a couple comments here, but we've been looking for money for quite a while to tie this sector more closely to the climate conversation. And it's impossible. Climate funders just don't see it. They're like, there's no tons in Africa. We're going to invest in China and India. What about the future tons? So if you can work with this sector to help advance that, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, we're going to both slog against that. I spent a day in the Bay Area with the climate funders, and I mean, I think the way I think about it is in the language of climate, it's a fat tail risk. I mean, if Africa electrifies like China electrifies, right, you're toast. Yeah. Right? I don't care what the IEA says, you're still toast. So you need to address this question. Let me try and get a question to you before I completely betray my promises.
Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity from Duke here. I've been with the Lighting Global program of IFC. I've been with that for 10 years. Started a non-profit and social entrepreneur 20 years ago, making these technologies, cutting them with glass cutters in the villages of Africa when there was nothing else, right? So having seen all of that, I'm currently absolutely astounded by the rate of technological innovation and the impact that that can have on transformative developmental change across the board. And I want us to draw from things like the Singularity University, Rob Nail, I think is his name, where we had him at the World Bank recently, telling the World Bank Group how the technology disruption is going to transform the whole world of development. And I want to bring that to really emphasize this point of multi-holder stakeholder engagement being absolutely essential at this stage, where it's amazing enough what's possible with what we can see. Andy's point earlier, I just wanted to really underscore that. We have people emphasizing that kids can learn to read in 1.5 years using an iPad nowadays, if they could do that in Africa. Think about all the rest. We have innovators doing mobile health clinics, taking blood pressure, and a whole range of all manner of health checks using a virtual web-based medical care system powered by a solar backpack. I mean, literally, almost every single sector can be transformed by the energy, and I'd ask you if you can step up ways of incorporating that future vision into the current approach. How can you do that, and how could we stimulate further engagement with the World Bank and with the other sectors? What would be a platform to do that? I think that's what we need more of, and this has been a great start. Thank you.
I'm going to take that as a comment. I'm going to ask her one more question, and then I think I have to do it to close us. In the back.
Thank you. Sorry, Dana Rishankova from the World Bank. I have a question to the panel, since this is about the last mile. I'm just wondering, on one hand, we see this huge technology progress that is happening on off-grid, and you see all the new appliances coming up, fancy TVs, and make the products definitely more attractive, and everyone is looking at, yeah, this is a real alternative to the grid because it can deliver the same things. But on the other hand, I wonder whether there is a risk by moving sort of towards fancy and fancier appliances that we moving away from the poor, that basically the market is concentrating on serving the needs of those that actually can pay for these appliances. Do you see that as a risk, or do you see there are sort of parallel trends of moving sort of more towards both satisfying the needs of those less poor as well as those poor.
Can I address that? I see that not only as a risk, but a reality. I would say over the past few years, as we have seen some commercial solutions really take hold, things like off-grid electric and some of the others, that there has been a shift of financing towards financeable solutions, which makes a lot of sense. And what has happened is the very last mile customer, the very rural, the pre-commercial market has seen less financing made available to it. And so we are seeing, Solar Sister focuses on that particular market, and we actually see less money available. What used to be philanthropic funds that would be made available for that end of the market have taken a look at all of the news coming out, like all of this impact investors are going towards energy. Oh, they don't need us anymore. And so they're moving off onto other things. And what we see is that gap, it's smaller because there is a lot of innovation and financing going towards this middle tier market. So the gap is smaller, but it's kind of deeper. And so I think it really calls to appreciating that this is going to have to take a blended solution, that we do need philanthropy, we do need impact investors, we do need commercial money, and across the whole spectrum. And just thinking that we can just move on with and leave them behind, I think is a real risk.
Any last comment, or I may have to close us?
Maybe just to say that it's not necessarily fully something to be worried about, that people are being offered packages and solar home systems that fulfill more energy needs. However, what you're saying emphasizes the need for the other categories of financiers to step up to the plate to help with the base of the pyramid part, which is never going to be appealing for fully commercially priced and financed solutions, so that we can make sure nobody is left behind.
Just one final sort of step back, just to highlight the vested interests and the political challenge that we actually do still face at a sort of very 30,000 foot or 60,000 foot level. I mean, there are still very powerful interests within the fossil fuel industry who are using energy access as a hook to try and push their technologies. And, I can't believe I'm still banging on about this, but, we only have to look as far as back as last year's G20, where historically G20 communiques are baked months in advance, but last year was an exception. It went right up until the last hour because a line was inserted around fossil fuels use for energy access. So this is a very real reality of what we're fighting against. And, I think people should just be aware that high-level political engagement is still very critical.
All right, as I said at the beginning, I could probably take 50 more minutes and explore with each friend. Actually, on behalf of Duke, I hope you will allow us to come back to you for at least 50 minutes to explore how we could work with you in the future. But it's been a tremendously rich panel. I thank you all for giving your time and your partnership.
Thank you for your facilitation.
Thank you.